Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Stream, soon to be in the future known as Prudent Observations. Today, I am joined by a returning guest and one of my favorite meds on Earth to talk to, Furius Pertinax from the Pasta Posse over in Apostolic Majesty's channel. Furius, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing wonderful. As we were just saying pre-show, just a titch tired because yesterday we did episode 2 on Mr. Majesty's channel regarding what we probably erroneously describe as a brief history of Armenia, which isn't brief, and then jumped on with Settler to talk about Mr. Peterson's recent comments. So it's obviously been a heavily bookended weekend, but lovely to be here. And your channel is one of my favorites and has been for some time. So. And we have obviously a very interesting topic to discuss today, so I look forward to it.
Yeah, so today with it being sort of in the, outside, we're focusing morely on the Aegean Sea, but I'm sure that you have plenty of that you might want to get into right now with the recent results from Italy. If you wanted to get anything off your chest, now would be the time.
Actually, just before we even get started, because there's been a few housekeeping changes since I was last on. I do love the intro, by the way. I was transformed and taken straight back to my high school years, where used to play Age of Empires with my friends. So I love the music. It's very nostalgic.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty fitting, and Cyberpunk Internal Affairs has done a really good job.
Absolutely. I actually, honestly, I've only just woken up because it's quite early in the penal colony, but I do know that there's optimism for Brothers of Italy, but I actually haven't looked at results yet, so I'm gonna have to peer at them after, unless you've caught up on things before the show.
Well, they secured their majority for the coalition, so it's been nice to watch blue checks seethe.
Yes, of course. And I mean, I know you probably saw me share a few links, like in some of our group chats, and it's always that specter of how they like to label. Oh, it's a return of XYZ and ABC, and it's a setback for European democracy and whatever. And you're quite right. There's much dilation and tears happening. So, if nothing else, it brings a wry smile to my face.
It sure does. So good luck to our friends in Italy for in all that regard. But today we're going
Indeed,
to
Viva Italia, right?
indeed. So we're going to shift our focus away from Italy and the Mediterranean and the good folks of Virgil and the Aeneid. Instead, we're going to focus a little more close on the issue of the Aegean Sea. So this is not going to be a sort of comprehensive or short history of the Aegean dispute. That would necessitate Furious and I to be here for perhaps 3 hours to talk about the last 200 some odd years of history in that region.
One could call it an eon.
Yes. However, I will note that we're going to cover some recent events because earlier this year in September, there were some inflammatory remarks from both President Erdogan and the Greek Prime Minister over issues in the Aegean. So, the area that we're going to start with very early on is to give you sort of a geographic rundown as well as some treaties that significantly affect how we're going to talk about this. We're going to try our best to be as objective as possible. Neither of us here, I think, have taken a very pro-Greek or pro-Turkish side. So I know I have a large international audience, and so correct and forgive me in case we do get anything wrong or offend your personal touches and your patriotism. But the first map that I wanted to bring up is that there are certain islands in the Aegean Sea since Greek independence and numerous treaties such as Lausanne, the Treaty of the Montreux Convention, and then, of course, the Paris Peace Treaties in 1947. So we're going to bring a map up to sort of talk about some of these important demilitarized islands that have come up again and caused recent concern. So let's go bring up the first one that kind of gives us a pretty good uh, geographic one. Let me see if I can zoom in for you all. That
And
one
let's
we
face
can...
it, who doesn't love maps, right?
Well, this is one of my favorite parts about doing this is maps, because half of my audience is American, so it's always a good time to talk about geography. So let's not, you know. But so, of course, the Aegean Sea, primarily, of course, between Greece and Turkey. Down below, of course, we have the contested, demilitarized and split island of Crete. And you can see throughout these areas, we've got a good portion of the islands that are demilitarized. However, there has been recent rearmament in some of these islands that we'll get into further detail with another map soon, from the Greeks. But there's also been a change in foreign policy from the Turks as well that has led to a, underneath the main purview of NATO and the other conflict that is currently going on right now in Russia and Ukraine, that has been bubbling actually for quite a few years now, ranging over issues of buying Russian armament and equipment, such as the S-300 and S-400 missile systems. This also includes NATO joint exercises that have happened in the Aegean Sea that has led to Greek air defense systems targeting Turkish F-16s, and most recently a more more expansionist, but also nationalist sort of diversionary foreign policy that has come from the Turkish government, known as the Blue Homeland, which has been a significant shift from its 2014 era foreign policy to today. So really, since Erdogan has concentrated power in 2015, we have seen a significant shift, more nationalist, more of an expansionist one in the Aegean Sea, and we'll talk about that shortly. But um, I guess the more important part here would be to talk about these three main agreements that we've brought up, that we were talking before we went live on air. The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, the Montreux Convention of 1936, and the Paris Peace Treaties in 1947. And Furious, I know that you had some things that you wanted to talk about with the Treaty of Lausanne.
Oh, well, I suppose, how does Lausanne come into being? And in the end, it's probably good that we try and keep this as narrow as possible. But
Sure.
with conflicts such as this, there's inevitably background. And if you just permit me a couple of minutes, I'll try and just summarize it. Is that these islands here, why are they important to Greece? Now, what we understand is continental Greece has been central to Greek civilization for literally thousands of years. If you think back to the Mycenaeans, you're talking a period that's 4,000 years prior to our own. And the islands constituted what we would call Ionian Greece. And there were obviously Greek cities and Greek polises on the mainland. And I suppose for Greece, in a historical context, these always formed a sphere. There were Greeks west of the Aegean and east of the Aegean. Whereas now, obviously, as a consequence of the hardships of the First World War and the population exchange that occurred after 1923, that question, shall I say, has been dealt with from the Turkish perspective. But of course, the Greeks did retain control of the islands as a result of their inability to enforce the treaty prior to Lausanne, which was the Treaty of Sèvres, which was the treaty directly signed at the end of World War One. Lausanne was essentially a do-over of the previous Treaty of Sèvres. And of course, like we were talking prior to the show, had they had a clean land border in Anatolia, much of the problem which has arisen would not be. But because there is essentially an international border that resides between islands and mainland, where there's only coastal distances of a matter of a handful of nautical miles or nautical kilometers, it greatly complicates this for both countries. And we are seeing, in essence, and what we've seen for several decades prior to now, is the difficulty of trying to maintain the balance of this between two powers who have a shared economic and military interest in the same, what you call an inland sea, I suppose, or like this portion of the Mediterranean, which we call the Aegean.
Yeah, and the Treaty of Sèvres was, deemed to be they didn't recognize its sovereignty, or Ataturk did with the new government. And afterwards, this is what had come out into play in the um, 1920. Well, it started in 1922, but it officially was put into place in 1924 in August. And this was, of course, to sort of exchange, prisoners of war, but also to settle land disputes and borders in that time frame. It did leave, of course, quite a bit up in the air that would later be dealt with in, say, the Montreux Convention of 1936. But it did have to deal, of course, with population exchanges, as well as making sure that there were other agreements put into place as well. For instance, the U.S. had its own separate agreement in which the United States had approved the, founded recognition of the new Republic of Turkey, alongside with ratifying and oil agreements, and that is most famously known as the Chester Concession. But
And just briefly too, just for the sake of the audience, let's also keep in mind that as a result of the consequence of the 1912 Italo-Turkish War, where Italy seized Libya off the Ottoman Empire, Italy also seized Rhodes and the Dodecanese. And so they actually were never party to the population exchanges, and Greece only gained control of these islands, which is that a portion of that purple cluster on this map here, Rhodos, and it's the northern collection of islands there. The Greece only attained control over them in 47, 48, following World War II. So just, not that it really matters, but just that's worth keeping in mind as a technicality.
Yes, and the island of Kos there is going to be particularly important for today's discussion, alongside with a few other islands as well that are mentioned here as well. But what followed this, and I will also sort of share and zoom in on this particular map so we can also understand about the land border that we're dealing with as well, that later have concerns over who has complete sovereignty over the Bosphorus Strait and later the Dardanelles. And let me go put this one up as well. So I'll share this one and we'll zoom in real quick so I can look at that already. So yeah, we have a demilitarized region, of course, with the border changing, of course, with Istanbul, the Bosphorus Strait, this demilitarized region, along with new land borders, and consequently, annexation of Cyprus from the British in 1914. But a land border is now officially established with what would become Syria and Iraq at this time, and we now have official land borders here. The Aegean Sea, however, would become later a more complex issue. It wouldn't just be, satisfied by what happens in 1923. We do have two other important treaties that we do have to cover. If you've heard me mention the Montreux Convention before, that is because it is still relevant and impacted today, especially because that treaty more or less does give complete territorial sovereignty over the ability to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, and which has been invoked by the Turkish government since the start of the conflict in Ukraine in February. So it has allowed more or less to tell the rest of the West to not come in. Russia has been allowed to leave.
Just as a quick point about the Bosphorus, because I'm wary that with this subject, tangents are very easy to go on. But just for the sake of, we often cover strategy on your channel, and for anyone who's interested, the Dardanelles and the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, has been important. If you read, for instance, the Peloponnesian War, which is about the conflict between the Delian League of Athens and Sparta and its allies, from the middle of the middle of the first millennium BC, you're talking like 480, 500 BC and earlier. The Athenians were shipping grain from the Crimea to feed Athens via the Sea of Marmara and the Straits. And, since then, people have realized how important control over this part of the world is and these sea lanes are, and they have remained important since then. So, I mean, this is no minor issue. The Montreux Convention was a very important treaty for the Turks themselves and for their regional neighbors and for any sort of strategic partners that they would have. In terms of, it's important for Russia because otherwise the Black Sea is literally closed off. It is important previously for the British and the French, and then later the Americans, because it gives them access north of what we'd call Constantinople or Istanbul. these are some of the most vital waters on the planet and have been for a long time.
Yes, and what follows after, of course, is the rising, growth of what would be the 1930s, mid-century Italy, which everyone now is getting all panicky about with the recent election results. But let's not
Well,
kid
the
ourselves
blue
here.
checks are right.
Yeah, the blue check star. I don't think any of us think that.
Yes.
I think that many people would just be happy if the trains ran on time, but I don't think that that's what we're currently running into. But after, of course, Mussolini rises to power, the Turkish government is beginning to raise significant concerns about the question of the straits, which of course is the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, and it demilitarized them and opened the straits to unrestricted civilian as well as military traffic. It had the League of Nations take a much stronger role in regards to making sure that that area was demilitarized. I think the League of Nations had something called the Straits Commission that dealt with all over the world. But of course, by the late 1930s, things had definitely changed because the Greek inhabited, I'm going to try my best, Dodecanese islands, which were the ones down towards the south, which also still play a significant amount of importance today, had been under now the control of Italy at the time under Mussolini's government. And in doing so, this allowed them to, make advances, of course, into Libya and other parts in North Africa. The Turkish government at the time had raised significant concerns that this could be used as a way to exploit and expand their power in that area, to which the Turkish government dispatches a lengthy diplomatic note to all of the signatory parties to the Treaty of Lausanne about how to get a different answer. This is already after the Abyssinia crisis in 1935.
Indeed, and that also plays in just very briefly plays into the fact that when the Treaty of Sèvres was signed immediately after World War One, Italy was to be a beneficiary of continental Anatolia. They were to receive a portion of what we would historically call Caria and Lycia, which is sort of. Can you just go back to that previous map, or can you pull up the last map that you had up? Um, and so because it was just across the sea from Rhodes and the Dodecanese, the Turks were always concerned that with a Turkish entry into the war, or with a mingling of Turkey being caught up in the conflict of the Second World War, that Italy would actually possibly press those claims, as they did, say, in Albania, as they did in Dalmatia. Yeah, so if you see Antalya, which is sort of corresponds with what people call the Turkish Riviera. If you draw a line sort of west northwest of that to say Samos, which is an island just south of Izmir, that was more or less the Italian acquisition from Sèvres. So Italy being able to invade sort of north from Rhodes and the Dodecanese, there was that quite legitimate fear of the Turkish government that that could be enforced at a later date, because the Italian government and the Italian army of this period was actually doing so as a result of Mussolini's foreign policy.
Yes, and this, of course, the Montreux Convention sort of begins in 1936, which leads, of course, to this convention and its parties signing on to it. The United States and Italy, of course, are absent in part due to the United States having a much more isolationist policy at this time. The U.S. had not been fully dragged into what would become the Second World War, any sort of European affair yet. And of course, Italy aggressively not in attendance for its own geopolitical interests. However, the terms of this convention replaced the 1923 Lausanne Treaty sections on the issues of Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. We're going to bring up a little map here that in just a second here, but the terms of the convention were more or less really focused on what the geopolitical situation looked like in the mid 1930s. This would, of course, mean that the sovereignty and sort of the territorial control would remain back in the hands, of course, of the Turkish government at the time, dealing with sort of the militarization and how that traffic can pass through. So it regulates maritime traffic through the Turkish Straits, guaranteeing complete freedom of passage for all civilian vessels in a time of peace. In peacetime, military vessels are limited in number, tonnage, and weaponry, with specific rules for how long they can stay inside and be through there. And they also have to give advance notification to the Turkish government. Um, However, the wartime clauses, with Turkey not being involved in a war, they can invoke this convention to make sure that nations don't pass through the straits unless they're returning to their respective home ports or their bases. And then at that time, if Turkey's at war, they can simply close the straits if they so wish. And as we've mentioned earlier, the Montreux Convention of 1936 has been invoked primarily to keep other Western powers out, but also to ensure that Russia couldn't bring more people in. And they're supposed to bring in with announcements about when they're leaving and so on. And so to emphasize where we're looking at now as well, and then this all plays into what we're currently talking about with Greece and Turkey and the Aegean, but this allows them to have a pretty strong control over where it is they're going. Let me zoom out here for everyone's viewing pleasure. So these are the two areas in which modern day Turkey still has sovereignty, control, and governing over these two straits in the same way that the United States has territorial, claims and regulations over the issues of the Panama Canal, although ours is a little more with the Panama government also having quite a bit of a say as well now these days. But they still have,
and just for reference, just for the sake of reference, we would call this area Eastern Thrace or European Turkey. That's on the north and western side of the strait.
Yes. And this, of course, is what allows a significant portion of, goods from the Black Sea, particularly, Ukraine and Russia specifically, when it comes to grain and wheat exports. When Ukraine also wasn't dealing with the current conflict with Russia and this war happening right now, we would also see a significant amount of semiconductors being also shipped out of here because there are two Ukrainian companies that are currently no longer in operation due to the war and the subsequent conflict that had produced 50% of all of the semiconductor grade neon needed for semiconductor manufacturing that would go to places like Taiwan or the United States and other major chip producers across the world. And that's a big reason why we've seen such a significant amount of supply chain issues in that regard of semiconductor production. But the Black Sea, of course, is not our main area of focus, but just to tell you how important, Turkish sovereignty is over these areas, about what can come in and come out, and how the war that we're currently seeing affects that. But we're going to move now back to our primary area, which is, of course, the Aegean Sea.
Just while you're transferring from map to map, I just put a couple of things in the chat if you want to.
Oh, sure.
We can. Is that this waterway is so important that actually the Turkish government, and it's been sort of on the cards for a little while, and I believe Erdogan just recently has initiated the first steps of this, but the Turkish government has wished to actually build a second canal that lies just north of the city of modern day Istanbul, calling it the Istanbul Canal, because this waterway, because of the amount of traffic that is coming in out of the Black Sea, because the Black Sea itself is a major area of economic activity, they actually feel as if they require a second waterway to facilitate the traffic, which is another point just on that is exactly why the Turks have, in, shall I say, recent decades, has actually favored the construction of gas pipelines just to reduce the amount of sea traffic coming through what was the old straits, and just unblocking the sea lanes, because the number of ships that pass through this. I mean, I've actually been to Istanbul myself. I was there for about 10 days, and the waterways are just always this hive of activity. They're stupidly busy. And so this project here for the government has been on the cards for quite some time, and I believe if the Turkish government actually gets control of their economy in the near future, this will be one of the most important projects that they'll undertake.
Yeah, and this illustrates just the growth and change in foreign policy that we've seen out of the Turkish government in the last, I would say 10 years, but especially kicking off after the attempted coup kerfuffle. I don't even know how that deserves a stream in and of itself to talk about.
It could do for sure. It's very much a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's a rabbit hole of clearing out Erdogan's political rivals and enemies at the same time. There's some American influence in there as well, based upon the coup leader, being here in the United States under asylum. Anyways, this is a big part of sort of Turkey expanding its foreign policy outward to be a much larger regional hegemon in the area. And we've seen this not just in the Aegean, but in other parts of the Middle East, whether it's in the Syria conflict, the um, Azerbaijan and Armenia conflict, and of course some allegations of Turkish involvement and influence with last year's problem inside of Kazakhstan that Semyagok and I had covered, that there were some allegations from both the Russian and Kazakh governments about that. So the last decade has definitely seen a shift in Turkish foreign policy, which has also brought us again to this long-standing struggle and history over the Aegean between Greece and Turkey. But that, of course, goes
Mm.
back, centuries, if not over 1,000 years.
Well, exactly. Just for as a modern observation, pardon me, to make about this is, as you can see from this small map here, it doesn't actually show much south of the straits on the Asiatic side, but modern day Istanbul has become a huge sprawling city. And one thing I will emphasize is that when I was there, what was now 8 years ago, something like that, 7 8 years ago, is that the amount of industry that they're constructing around the capital is huge, and it does play into this Greece Turkey thing, because where Turkey traditionally struggled was with manufacturing, what you call industrial capacity or industrial, um, you know, the ability to produce goods, and not so much services but goods, whether it's in the agricultural sector or the military sector, or even its ability to sort of undertake public works projects. Turkey traditionally struggled in that, but the modern state of Turkey does not. It is, in the last 25, 30 years, basically for the sort of lifetime of people like us, Turkey has greatly ramped up their capacity to undertake these sort of things. And if you ever were to travel to Istanbul, you would see nothing but construction cranes and factories being erected at an astonishing rate. And it's something where the modern Turkish sort of government slash regime has placed a lot of emphasis on, because Greece is a country that has always actually struggled to expand upon its relatively modest base, whereas Turkey has made that has placed great emphasis on doing so in that regard.
Yeah, and again, this does illustrate one of the bigger problems I think that we're going to talk about is just the differing perspectives of foreign policy between these two nations. One of the things that I will sort of provide this as a transition now into sort of the main topic over the issues over the Aegean Sea is that Greece has enjoyed, by nature of its economic relationship to the European Union, on top of its now more recent relationship with France, which we'll talk about, has enjoyed a more collective economic and security based framework over Turkey's regional concerns, for a much more expansionist foreign policy. This has allowed Greece to sort of take advantage of both the American and European Union sanctions regime, and while it tries its best to catch up defensively to Turkey, whereas Turkey has been trying to exercise a much larger role in the international stage and community. When it comes to the war into Ukraine, for instance, President Erdogan has offered and has spoken to both President Zelensky as well as President Putin about negotiating a peace talk and other such agreements for ceasefires and humanitarian corridors. On top of the fact that Turkey has also been recently in the past has purchased Russian S-400 anti-air ballistic anti-air missile systems, which has led to sanctions from the United States. On top of the fact that Turkey has its own internal policy with regards to ethnic Kurds, which has allowed them to take a much different policy with regards to Syria, counterintuitive to say what the USG wants. And they've also been supplying the Ukrainians the KB-2 drone system, which is domestically produced in that area. And this is on top of the fact that they've been ramping up their militarization, both with domestic submarine production, but also purchasing naval equipment from the Germans, which has seen over the last 10 years an increase of what has been classically known in the international relations community as the security dilemma. For those of you who don't know what that term is, the security dilemma is basically the ongoing problem where states will increase their own security. So they'll up their own defense spending, they'll up their own rhetoric for the situation of defense or national security from other states, or they'll be even more vague and talk about, foreign issues, which usually can decrease the state's security situation because they're not in complete communication with other national parties, and in turn can lead to an arms race, or by extension lead to incidental actual hot fire and kinetic conflict. And the most classic sign of this, of course, is usually the arms race between the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That in order and an increase to their own security position, the likelihood of conflict only increased, and the other security issues being raised, such as fissile material malfunctions, testing equipment going into the wrong hands. Ken Booth has a really good book on this that I highly recommend. But we're seeing a very miniature version of the security dilemma play out inside of Turkey and the Aegean Sea and Greece. And one of the things that I think we'll highlight in today's discussion, as we've been ongoing, is that the security dilemma that we're seeing in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey also highlights some of the limitations of large-scale security umbrellas. We've talked a little bit about this before on this channel. I want to say about a year ago, around this time, September, October timeframe, on this issue. And one of the things that we are continuingly to see is that while sort of Germany and Turkey are, have this military purchasing agreement going on, and that there's now a French-Greece bilateral defense agreement that has been put into place since the French kind of got the kick to the road out of the bar room when the AUKUS agreement was formed between Australia, the UK, and the United States. We're now beginning to see just underneath the umbrella of NATO, all these sort of bilateral agreements play out. And it does illustrate that absent a collective security threat, so in the eyes of NATO, it would be that of Russia, that when there isn't one, then these sort of things tend to happen, and they're still playing out, which is why we're talking about it today.
Yes, exactly. And it's also demonstrative of a consequence where when you have a large alliance, which is what NATO is when you consider the number of countries that make up NATO. And I suppose NATO has had difficulty justifying its purpose and point following the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. Although we've had, shall I say, a reawakening of Russian desire to secure its sphere in the world. I'll just leave it there, right?
Yeah.
But NATO and Greece, within that same alliance themselves, having quite diametrically opposed, or rather each other's aims and focuses are sort of directed at each other. So within this alliance, you've got sort of like a two butting of ram heads within the same field. And that eventually, if it's not dealt with, shall I say, it becomes an intransigent problem within this alliance framework, whereby they're meant to cooperate, but their own strategic necessities prevent that for happening within these two countries specifically.
Yeah, and so let's put up a map here, so maybe we can get a better understanding of some of the ongoing tensions in the area, and then we can talk about the recent claims of militarization from the Greeks by the Turkish government, and we'll talk about some of the more expansionist positions that the Turkish government has also put out. So, to give you sort of a broad look at the situation in the Aegean, let's bring up, this was a pretty good map from the AFP news service. Let me see if I need to zoom in here real quick. Yeah, I'll zoom in. And this is going to just sort of illustrate a variety of maritime border disputes. So, all right, now that that's done. So, of course, we have Greece and Turkey here. So one of the more important things that we also need to talk about is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which Greece is a signatory party to and Turkey is not. And this more or less allows the discussions and overviews on exclusive economic zones, how to govern and replace the Convention of the High Seas that was back in the 1950s. And this has been going on from, let's say, the 1970s up into 1994 is when it finally became in force. However, the convention always has a difficult issue when it comes to, maritime law between various nation states that are part of it and those that are not. For instance, very famously, the United States is not a signatory party to the to the the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Turkey is not, but Greece is, which causes some issues here over exclusive economic zones on top of previous agreements as well, whether it's the 1947 peace treaty agreement or even the Luhansk agreement that we talked about earlier. So this little line in blue across the Aegean into the Mediterranean Sea is the Greek exclusive economic zone that allows them to sort of enjoy their trade in doing so. This area in red, which you'll notice right here, Costorizo is or Kos, depending on how you wish to go about it. There's this tiny little island here in which Greece has territorial claim to, which of course overlaps with Turkish oil exploration and license. And this isn't even beginning to touch the very complicated issue of Cyprus. But that's a stream for a future day.
The infamous CQ.
Yeah, the Cyprus question, indeed. But so this area also plays a very large role into what we're talking about today, because Turkey does wish to expand into this, and the sort of get around to placate both, what has now become sort of the Med East Gas Forum, which was meant in charge and formally put in place in 2019, that would hopefully kick off with the East Med pipeline that would try their best to bypass this area and work more closely with, say, the Leviathan and there's one other major oil field out here. But it would primarily have a planned pipeline out from the territorial exclusive economic zone of Israel and sort of bypass this area in red and connect up to Greece. This was earlier at the beginning of this year, famously canceled by the American government. They had pulled out of it, which had caused significant tensions both between Greece and Israel and their relationship to the United States. And this is on top of the fact that the USG has to balance its relationship not only between those two countries, but on top of Greece as well, or Turkey as well, especially as Turkey has played a much larger role in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and really by extension, the West and Russia. On top of the fact that they play a much larger role also for the United States as well as the EU's policy with regards to migrants, which we'll talk about a little bit later today, because demography is a weapon. I think we all know that here, especially when it comes to President Erdogan famously warning the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen that he's more or less got a $2.4 million trump card over the EU, which is the threat of releasing them and moving them out there, despite 2015 and 2017 agreements between the EU and Turkey to try and keep things on their side of the Aegean and their side of Asia Minor. But this is going to play a very large chunk into what we're talking about today. So I think what we'll start with first is the change in Turkish foreign policy. Then we'll talk about Greek militarization and why this issue I don't think is going away anytime soon. So I'm going to pull up one more map, and this is not just this is more from Turkish government and foreign policy, but this is a very important one for our understanding. And this is known as Blue Homeland, or Mavi Vatan in Turkish. And I'm sure, Semyagog, if you're going to watch this or listen, you can, eviscerate me on my pronunciation in the comments. But this is the Blue Homeland concept. This is a 462,000 square kilometer proposal of what Turkey would like to have its claims in both the Aegean, the Marmara, which they already have territorial control over, and the Black Sea. So this is a significantly far more expansionist policy we've seen since 2016 onward, both taught at Turkish Naval Academy. But this came from also the former foreign minister, the one previous to our current Turkish foreign minister. This comes from Ahmet Davutoglu, and his policy, of course, was to provide a larger view of Turkish influence in the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea, having a significant change in their official policy and what's also on the books. This is also a reflection, as mentioned earlier, of a much more power play by the Turkish government, in doing so to not only have greater influence in their own immediate area to secure its exclusive economic zone, but also to fight back against what they perceive as an encroachment of both territorial but also economic sovereignty over their own interests and their own security interests as well, which has led us to where I think we're now, which is an interesting security dilemma. This has been a significant shift in Turkish foreign policy since 2016, since Erdogan has seen consolidation of power. This has only been spurred on by Western reactions, specifically both from the European Union, but as well as the United States, and with regards to things such as the usual claims of human rights violations, freedom of press, and of course, treatment of migrants and so on. However, in a more realpolitik fashion, Turkey has been able to effectively leverage that, in my opinion, against both the EU and the United States. But we'll get more into this. But this is the official sort of defense policy. We've seen plenty of retired admirals from the Turkish Navy, which has one of the largest landing forces available in terms of what we would call the European continent, that they could deploy if necessary, which again raises our concerns of security in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. There has been multiple calls, of course, for diplomacy, but this is why we're covering it.
Just if I may, because these comparisons are obviously different, right? There's a lot of distinctions between them, but there's something to recognize about islands that have close proximity to a coastline, and it's in some regard why the Taiwan question is so important. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because it is a rabbit hole to itself, but like to an extent, China is hemmed in by Taiwan not being a part of its country, not being a part of its borders, right? And in the same regard, as Turkey has wanted to sort of flex its muscles and has become a more powerful state. I mean, it's suffering a terrible inflation problem at the moment. But going back to what I was sort of saying before about that construction boom around Istanbul, and it's also true of other cities as well. It's true of Izmir, it's true of Bolu, it's true of Kocaeli. There's a bunch of places where there's been a lot of development and construction in the last sort of 15, 20 years. But the Greeks, because these islands are Greek and they're sort of historically Greek and ethnographically Greek, from the Turkish perspective, it does hem them in. And I suppose for any country that wishes to express itself strategically and to sort of press its own interests, being hemmed in by islands that aren't yours provide very much a strategic conundrum in that sense. It's just worth thinking on from that standpoint.
Yeah, and this is not something that has just happened overnight. Like we said at the beginning, if we wanted to talk about the Turkish and Greek disputes over the Aegean, we would have to pull an apostolic majesty and talk about the last 200 years in a 4-hour stream. But this one of the bigger things that I think has also seen some escalation from the Turkish government has been primarily its increase in naval militarization. So I'm going to share with us an archived article from the Atlantic not the Atlantic, the Economist, and we will definitely give us a clear sign of also what we're dealing with. Remember, kids, always use archive today. I know that's a very Styx Hexenhammer thing to say, but he's right about that.
Just before we take off on this article, just want to mention quite briefly, the sea is one area where the Greeks, I'm talking in the modern context, because historically the Greeks always are seafaring people and were very adept at sailing and navies, and even from an economic standpoint, the Aegean has always been, and to some degree the Ionian Sea has always been this sort of hub of Greek activity. Like even in Roman times, the Greeks were very much in their own element at sea, and resorting to naval commerce and trade. It's always been a center point from them from a civilizational standpoint. It's just a very Greek thing. And in the modern day, even though the Greek state has struggled with industrialization, has struggled with industrial capacity, if you look at, say, the Onassis family, Aristotle Onassis, who was actually ironically a survivor from the Anatolian catastrophe, the modern Greek state has always actually had a relatively strong shipping and sort of naval supply shipyard kind of industry, and a lot of Mediterranean sea trade today is actually still to some degree dominated by the Greeks. And one area where the Turks have spent a lot of money and a lot of emphasis, something they've really sought to do, is make up that deficiency. And if you look at, because we'll obviously touch on the subs and the frigates and destroyers and stuff a bit later. But if you look at, say, the Kocaeli shipyards, the Turks have really made a point to orient themselves in making up ground in that one deficiency they do have is in shipping and in shipyards, naval construction, because that is where, say, in the modern era, post Ottoman Empire, the Turks have struggled. And I suppose we'll touch on that later, but it's just worth, emphasizing that.
Yeah, and so in terms of moving towards the more blue homeland orientation of a much more, I don't want to say the word aggressive, but I think that that would be a good term for this because they are definitely changing their posture in regards to the Aegean and their own position as a regional hegemon, which Erdogan views
You,
himself definitely
yeah,
to be, regardless
you
of
could,
the
yeah,
economy or how well they're doing.
you could say they're flexing their muscles.
Yeah,
Let's
this
say,
is definitely a
yeah,
flex.
it's a flex.
But this is from last year in July, but still plays an important part for today's discussion and narrative. Is that German submarines are giving Turkey an edge over Greece, which of course makes the Eastern Mediterranean less stable. But also, hey, speaking of which, there's our first point about the Gulf of Izmit. Um, and the very shipyard that you had mentioned. Turkey's naval future is slowly taking shape. The first of 6 German designed submarines lie in the water after being floated out on the dock in March. The Piraeus will join the fleet next year. 5 other Reese-class subs will follow in successive years. It is a triumph for Turkey's navy and a headache for Greece. Over the past year, Turkey and Greece, despite being both members of NATO, have sparred in the Mediterranean. Their warships collided last summer in 2020 after Turkey sent a survey vessel into disputed waters. Greece responded by rallying allies in Europe and the Middle East and bought a slew of French warplanes, and in December announced doubling of its defense spending to 5.5 billion euros. That, though, is still less than half the Turkish level. Turkey's navy is bigger and newer, and the Anadolu, the Spanish-designed light aircraft carrier, is in the final stages of construction. New submarines would compound the problem. The Reese class is the version of Germany's Type 214, which is operated by the navies of Portugal, South Korea, and Greece itself. An important feature is its air-independent propulsion, which allows subs to go without air supply that a diesel engine would normally require. A traditional diesel-electric stub can stay under the water for 2 or 3 days. Those with AIP can do so for 3 weeks, says Johannes Peters of the Institute of Security Policy Kiel, and with almost zero noise emissions compared to noisier nuclear-powered subs whose reactors cannot be turned off. That is perfect for the shallow waters around Greco-Turkish flashpoints. Um, and I think that that's a really good illustration of what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
You're dealing with submarines that are harder to detect, are an improvement upon already existing designs that, in fact, the Greeks use themselves. And I mean, these are diesel electric, which are probably exactly what you want in regards to much more shallower waters around contested and growing militarized hotspots in the Aegean, just because that is not as nearly as deep as, say, other parts of the Mediterranean or even the
Mm.
Black Sea.
Which for submarines, their ability to dive and the being able to limit the amount of cavitation and noise they generate underwater uh, very much determines their potential survivability as a weapon system, and in terms of keeping the crew alive, and the subs themselves, although cheaper than warships. You don't want to be from the standpoint of fighting. I mean, as say the Germans found out in the Second World War, you don't want to go losing subs at too fast a rate, because, like, unlike a ship, if a ship takes a critical hit, you can usually evacuate a crew. A submarine underwater, you don't have that luxury. So survivability and their ability to stay undetected and to create as little noise as possible is absolutely essential for the effectiveness of them as weapon systems.
Yeah, and as the article points out, this does serve a purpose for NATO as well. On June 23rd of 2021, a Russian ships fired shots towards a British destroyer in Crimean waters. 2 days later, the Russians began air and sea exercises in the Mediterranean, sparring with a British aircraft carrier strike group in the region. Then an American nuclear-armed submarine showed up in Gibraltar, and at the same time, the subs will reshape the naval balance between Turkey and Greece, says Emmanuel Karagiannis of King's College London. But as the article tells you, and as what we're talking about today, it is double-edged swords, as the subs could be used for intelligence gathering in disputed waters, including snooping around undersea cables that Greece plans to build to reach Cyprus, Egypt, and Israel. The subs may be armed with medium-range anti-ship missiles, which could largely neutralize Greek anti-submarine warfare capabilities, adds Mr. Karagiannis, although much depends on how well Turkey can integrate its indigenous weapons into the German design. Although Greece did not oppose the sub deal when it was agreed to in 2009, last year's jousting changed things. We're not saying you shouldn't sell them to Turkey, says a Greek official. What we're saying now is you should not sell them to this Turkey. Greece wants Germany to halt its sale and says that the subs could be sold to another country. It points to example to America, which barred Turkey from buying F-35 fighter jets 2 years ago after it bought Russian air defense systems, which is the S-400 missiles. Yet these pleas have fallen on deaf ears. And also to keep in mind for the Greeks, they have the S-300 missile systems as well. And when the American government decided to sanction Turkey by taking them off the list of F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, what's the export nations that they would give it to, or partner countries. The Turkish government, Erdogan, had pointed to the fact that the Greeks had a similar missile system as well from the Russians, yet it did not go that way. Such is the nature of sort of trying to keep Turkey in line under the USG's, sphere of influence, but also for everyone to stay on policy. But let's see here. The German resistance to scuttling the submarine deal is unsurprising. It is thought to be worth $3.5 billion, a hefty sum compared with total German arm exports over $14 billion in the last decade. The country commands the world's market for submarines in particular, having sold more than 120 of them to 17 navies across the world in the 1960s. The latest potential customer is Australia, which is toying with the idea of buying the German Type 214 to fill the gap until the newer French sub arrives in the 2030s. Well, the newer French subs won't arrive in the 2030s because that got scraped by the AUKUS agreement earlier in 2021, which we talked about on this channel. I think it's like episode 38, if I recall correctly, but it's on the playlist of the Sunday stream that you can look towards.
Yes, and on that, just on the AUKUS question quickly, yeah, that's another interesting example of where electoral political considerations override what is sensible defense policy, because we were going to like retrofit the French subs in Australia, and then because they did it to sort of shore up our naval industry, and then our government changed, and that was a whole kerfuffle in itself. But it just goes to show you that sort of when civilians make defense decisions, often it's not done with the interest of defense in mind. Often there can be other considerations.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing though I would also add about the AUKUS agreement is that I think it does illustrate this sort of Anglospheric and Anglo-centric sort of foreign policy that I think we're going to see really come out stronger in coming years, especially as the world economy continually has a shift towards Asiatic countries in particular, because that's been a very difficult thing. Yeah.
Of course, and of course, with this, shall I say, the current crisis that's occurring in Eastern Europe as well, they're going to want to reinforce solid alliances where they know they exist, which in AUKUS is probably, you can say, is still true.
This is the other part that I wanted to talk about today as well in this discussion was, in part of this is to keep migration in check. Angela Merkel, Germany's then chancellor, is obsessed with the issue, complains the Greek official. She's allowing Turkey to blackmail Europe, he adds. After an EU summit on June 24th, Mrs. Merkel said that the bloc had agreed to provide 3 billion euros for migrants in Turkey to follow on from a 6 billion euro package approved in 2016. Although the number of illegal crossings from the Eastern Mediterranean is down by half compared to 2020. There still remain over 3 million refugees in Turkey, which, again, the numbers may vary, but, he has said that Erdogan has threatened in the past, especially last, I want to say, August of 2021, when Ursula von Leyen and them came by, and you had that whole kerfuffle by not having a chair for her when they all came over to Ankara, that he's talked about in the past about having anywhere from like 2 to 3 million as a release valve. But in regards to the situation between Turkey and Greece, this is something that has been used before and is currently being discussed right now. The Guardian had reported earlier this year, actually just a few days ago on September 21st, that Syrian refugees are going to mass in a convoy from the Turkish border and walk into Greece. Tens of thousands of people were planning to enter the EU country together after, of course, and this is from The Guardian, so after alleged racist attacks and rising tensions. So I'll share this one here because on top of the Aegean issue, are we going to see demography once again play a big role in this? But yeah, I like this phrase. It's musical chairs, but of course for migrants as well.
It's a musical chairs with Turkish instruments.
Yeah, basically. Not to say the least.
Just wait for the snake charmers and the.
I'm not Mr. D. I don't have a soundboard as readily available.
Oh, unfortunately.
One of these days. One of these days. Since early September, Syrians have been drawing up plans to journey via a Telegram channel, which has now more than 85,000 members. The organizers, who are believed to be Syrian refugees themselves, press X to doubt, have told people to bring sleeping bags, tents, life jackets, water, canned food, and first aid kits. The actual number of people expected in the caravan is unclear, but organizers say about 100,000 people are expected. There are more than 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, where in parts of reports of rising tensions and violence against Syrians in parts of that country. That doesn't surprise me at all. As dawn broke on Monday, members of the caravan began their journey to designated points of Edirne, a city northwest of Turkey near the border with Greece, which announced on the Telegram channel the day before their plan is to walk across the Greek border and make their way into the EU. So this is something that, of course, Turkey does not have a problem with. And in fact, I would not be surprised if this is actively encouraged or organized by them. And this is something that I think we're going to continue to see more of because, again, demography is a weapon.
Doubtless.
Yes. But on top of that, as the old Steve Saylor saying goes, invade the world and invite the world. And then there's Morgoth's law that anytime a conflict happens, you're just going to get more refugees into Europe, which I think has just been evergreen in that regard. But, this is in part because both Turkey and Greece have a, security and sovereignty oriented foreign policy. And they've had this going on for eons. The debates over maritime and what is aerial zones that they claim for their jurisdiction has always been perceived as a threat perception, both from Turkey as well as Greece. Greece for the safety of these demilitarized zones and obvious ethnographic concerns, whereas Turkey wishes to have a much more security but also expansive-oriented foreign policy. For example, in certain issues, for instance, when the Aegean dispute that took place in 1996 happened, the Greeks had claimed that there were already distinct maritime borders as well as aerial zones between the two countries, pointing out the air identification zones in the 1950 creation of sort of the what's it called? The International Aerial ICO. That's what it's called. I'm going to try and see if I can find it. It's regards to oh Lord, I can't get it off the top of my head, but it's regards to how the dealing with aerial issues and identification for airports and communications. And they had said that, well, that doesn't actually mean that there's actual set upon borders. And this was from the Turkish government back in the 1990s. And this is definitely something that is going to take a long-standing role in how these two nations view this area in particular. But in part also has to do with regards to the inability to effectively communicate between the two nations. Turkey, has historically seen, especially in the last 15 years, the difficulty of actually speaking with Greece directly, because this also means the added baggage of dealing with the United States and the European Union, while at the same time, Greece knows that it can effectively rely on those institutions, both through sanctions, but also its own military agreements that will do so. Which, of course, is not anything new, but it does put aside some of our ongoing problems with there. Earlier this year, however, at the beginning of this month in September, Erdogan had laid a warning to the Greek government, saying on the, I think it was the 9th of September, if not back in July, he says, I warn Greece to avoid dreams, acts, and statements that would result in regret, and please come to your statements. And this was, of course, afterwards, there was a large-scale Turkish military drill near Izmir on the western coast of the country. And, it has provided a much more defensive posture or more of a military flex and saber rattling, talking about how they don't wish to have their rights ever renounced in the Aegean, and they will not back down from using their rights established both by international agreements, but also for their own defense, because they believe that many of these islands are being remilitarized by the Greek government. And in doing so, this has led to ongoing conditions that we've seen here. And this is primarily in regards to the specific islands of Kos, and then the other two islands that I know that were explicitly mentioned were Icaria and Rhodes. So on top of Kos, you have Rhodes, which is towards the part towards Crete, but as well as those getting very closer towards Turkey's direct coastline and south of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Strait. So things are getting incredibly hot and bothered in this area by claims of Greek remilitarization, which there is certainly some truth to that. And this is in part, I think, mainly due to the response of Greece's expansive policy under this blue homeland policy that they've been talking about, and has been sort of their modus operandi for naval and strategic considerations in the Aegean since 2016.
Yeah, and it's also just testament to the fact too that when you have friction, which occurs obviously between powers, be it minor or major, that are contesting an area, if one party starts to do flybys and another party is locking onto those aeroplanes, and then there's compelled to be more flyovers, and there's compelled to be air defense systems that are sent as reinforcement, and then you sort of get this eventual scaling up because neither side wants to back down. It becomes the the sort of like the poison pill for increasing tension, increasing friction that, in the worst case scenario sort of eventually turns hot. To some degree can sort of say that this has actually led to our present dilemma in Donbass, for instance. If two sides escalate, no one backs down, the consequences can end up being fatal in many respects. And this has been bubbling for many decades, what's happening in the Aegean here. I mean, it's got origins in the, we touched on them earlier in the stream. It does affect the Cypriot question. There's a lot of history between these two countries. So this is not unsurprising. Let me just say that.
Yeah, and so we can give the Turkish government their due. They do have a background note on the Aegean dispute. This comes out of their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So
actually, you should highlight. There's a comment here just by Cyber Ninja here. I think he touches on it perfect. It's exactly true. Brinksmanship is not an infinite game. Yes, that's right. Eventually, the elastic band snaps when pulled enough.
Yeah, it's 100% true. I mean, there's a lot of people that try their best to model it out, and the thing is about brinksmanship is that no model effectively survives when the rubber band snaps or when one takes it too far. This is why you can have so many game theory models about engagement, and they don't actually play out the way that you anticipate them. Most famously, Robert McNamara of the United States Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are some recordings of him that are quite interesting because he's flustered that the Soviet Union is not responding to the issue in Cuba that their models had predicted. But this is why you can only take things like the rational theory of war or game theory models and apply them in international relationships, because brinksmanship really does come down to who blinks and who commits.
Yeah, that's right.
But we'll get to what the Turkish government is saying here. Let me see if I can. I want that in English. I think I can. There we go. I can bring up the text so we can also read it here. But this is from the Turkish Foreign Ministry. And they say Turkey and Greece being the two littoral states that have legitimate rights and interests in the Aegean Sea. These involve their security, economy, and other traditional rights recognized by international law. Turkish-Greek differences over the Aegean and are related to the Aegean status quo established by the 1923 Lausanne Peace Treaty. The Lausanne Treaty established a political balance between Greece and Turkey by harmonizing vital interests of both countries, including those of the Aegean. Turkey fully respects the provisions of the Lausanne and in return expects Greece to act in the same manner. It is true that in 1923 the continental shelf concept was not foreseen. Nevertheless, the inherent balance of the Lausanne Treaty and the Aegean is a guideline in all respects, including the continental shelf. The basic thinking of the Lausanne Treaty is to grant coastal states limited areas of maritime jurisdiction and leave the rest of the parts in the Aegean to the common benefit of Turkey and Greece. It is clear that if one littoral state unilaterally extends its jurisdiction into the Aegean and deprives the other coastal state from exercising its existing rights, it is no longer possible to speak of the Lausanne imbalance in the Aegean. Consequently, the bilateral Turco-Greek relationship in the Aegean has to be based on the following principles. 1. The Aegean is a common sea between Turkey and Greece. Freedom of the high seas and the airspace above it, which is at present both coastal states as well as third countries enjoy, should not be impaired. Any acquisition of new maritime areas should be based on mutual consent and should be fair and equitable. And the fundamental source of tension between Turkey and Greece is the Greek perception to regard the entire Aegean Sea as a Greek sea, in total disregard of Turkey's rights and interests of one of the coastal states. Turkish policy is based on respect of the status quo, whereas Greece appears determined to alter it in its favor. The threat extending to Greek territorial waters beyond the present width of 6 miles, Greece extended her territorial waters from 3 miles to 6 miles in 1936. Turkey followed suit in 1964. The remilitarization of eastern Aegean islands placed under the demilitarized status by virtue of its very agreements, ceding them to Greece a 10-mile national airspace over territorial waters, abuse of the FIR responsibility as it confers sovereignty, the request of flight plans from state aircraft, and allegations of Athens FIR in regards to identification, can be counted among these efforts, which the real underlying causes of Turco-Greek conflict, which this will talk about the continental shelf, territorial waters, airspace, but this is the one I did want to focus on, which was the demilitarized status of eastern Aegean islands. So due to the security requirements of Turkey, the demilitarized status of eastern Aegean islands has been an essential element of Aegean status quo ever since they were placed under Greek sovereignty. The Athens decision of 1914 by the Six Powers stipulated a demilitarized status for the islands being turned over to Greece. Articles 12 and 13 of the Lausanne Peace Treaty and Article 4 of its Annex Convention confirmed the status. So this is giving us background as to where this has been. However, contrary to the status of the eastern Aegean islands, the Turkish territories, including the Aegean region, is not under such a demilitarized status. The Aegean army is basically a training army. This army has been established in Turkey on the legal ground and has a defensive character. On the other hand, the recent deployment of Exocet guided missile batteries, which are offensive weapons, on the islands under demilitarized status is a further example of blatant violation of existing international agreements. And this has been sort of the central issue of dispute between Turkey and Greece, between a more flexive and trying to be much more of a regional power in the area, not to mention the Blue Homeland, and what has been now perceived as the reason to up its territorial and sovereignty concerns from Greece as well, from Exocet guided missile batteries that had meant to target naval craft in the region, which is why you've seen ongoing issues over the past 25 years, whether it's targeting Turkish F-16s or the recent arms race underneath the NATO umbrella between Germany and Turkey, as well as at the same time, France and Greece have been enjoying a rather lucrative military armament deal and arrangement as well.
Indeed. Just as a quick aside, if I may.
Go for it.
Just for the sake of the discussion here, what we call the Greek islands in the Aegean, with the exception of Imbros and Tenedos, which are still actually part of Turkey, and the Turks have since renamed them, despite being occupied following World War One, the rest of the Aegean islands were actually the completion of their, the Greeks would say liberation, but the conquest of those islands by the nascent Greek state of the 19th and 20th century was actually completed in the aftermath of the First and Second Balkan War, which were in 1912 and 1913 respectively. All I'm saying is that the Greek control of those islands were established prior to the Treaty of Lausanne. Just in the case of that people didn't know, it's just an aside point that's worth considering.
So this also brings us to discuss the Greek perspective as well. Now that we've sort of covered some of the Turkish foreign policy as well as their position and their grievances. We can sort of hear back from what Greece has said, because what really sparked this off was concerns that this might trigger some kind of conflict between Greece and Turkey. The rhetoric had been significantly escalatory, but the Greek foreign minister Nikos Dendias had said that the behavior of his country's historical regional rival and NATO ally should be censured by both NATO, the United Nations, and the European Union. Um, by not doing so in a time or by underestimating the seriousness of this matter, we risk witnessing again a situation present similarly to that of currently unfolding in some other parts of our continent, he wrote in allusion to the war in Ukraine. This is something none of us would really wish to see. These letters, which were dated Monday and Tuesday, and this came at the beginning of the month on September 7th, come at a low point in relations between the two neighbors who are separated by a centuries-long enmity and contemporary disputes, including Aegean Sea boundaries and immigration. Greece and Turkey have come close to war 3 times in the last 50 years. Um, However, on that Tuesday, which I believe was let's see here, this was on the 6th of September. Turkey's president had a thinly veiled threat of invasion in regards to this, and Athens had responded it was ready to defend its territorial sovereignty. In letters to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, EU foreign policy head Josep Borrell, and the United Nations chief Antonio Guterres, Athens quoted Erdogan's references to Greek occupation of the Aegean Sea islands that have been a part of Greece for decades and to the Greek people as vile. I don't think we need to get into the 600 some odd words that both nations have to describe each other in slur-like ways. But
We should all have a
Dendias,
good idea without digging into it.
yeah, well, I'm sure your imagination can run wild.
Quite.
But then Dias continues saying, quote, the Turkish leadership has apparently chosen to present future aggression as already prepared and, more importantly, as a justified action. Unless seen in its true dimensions and properly dealt with by the international community, this Turkish attitude risks destabilizing our wider region and causing consequences of which the gravity is hard to assess. Um, Again, the ongoing dispute, of course, is between the um, remilitarization or keeping a military presence close to the Turkish Aegean coastline upon these areas. They've also, of course, have accused Greek air defenses from locking onto Turkish fighter jets during NATO exercises, to which the Greeks have denied. At the same time, though, the Greek foreign minister had also said and accused Turkey of carrying out over 6,100 Greek airspace violations in 2022, including 157 military overflights into Greek territory. Greece almost daily scrambles fighter aircraft to identify and intercept Turkish military planes and often simulated dogfights to break out, which has led to several fatalities in the previous decades. As in southern moment, prime point in time is dealing with a substantial economic problem they have been for years. But during this whole time, Prime Minister Mitsotakis has said that Greece isn't a threat to Turkey, but it does have a red line. And the Greek Prime Minister, this is said earlier this week at the United Nations General Assembly that is currently happening in New York. He has tried to argue for a more peaceful coexistence, while at the same time sort of deftly denying remilitarization under the claims of territorial sovereignty in the Aegean. That's been more or less the Greek perspective, and it has relied on more or less its balance of collective security. But as I had mentioned, Greece also sees Turkey, of course, as a rival in the area and a long-standing one. This goes back thousands of years into ancient Greece in the time of Asia Minor. But let's bring up our current issue that I think is also worth discussing, which is while the Turkish are enjoying German submarines, the Greeks are enjoying French military equipment.
Just on this note, very briefly for me,
Yeah.
Just did a bit of research. Like I said, I've had a bit of a hectic schedule, so I just had a quick gander bit this morning before we went live. So the Greeks operate what they call the Miko 200, which is um, uh, a a frigate destroyer, a frigate based out of Germany. And funnily enough, again, it's one of those things where the Greeks run a variant and the Turkish run a variant. The Turks call it the Yavuz class, and they also have an updated version called the Barbaros class. Meanwhile, and also just as an aside note, the Australians actually operate 8 of them as the Anzac class frigate. And the Greeks have 4 of them, which is run as the Hydra class. Meanwhile, we just touched before on the Type 214. I don't know if we want to circle back to this later, but the Greeks actually had ordered them before the Turkish have, but the Greeks have had a huge amount of trouble with the 214 and actually accommodating it for their needs. And this also happened just prior to the financial crisis, and of course, the Greek government was put under austerity, and think Greece had a bad time in the midst of the GFC and afterwards. And so they only got a delivery of 2 from a planned, I think, 8 or 9 of them. So the Turks have actually been far more forthcoming in actually paying their bills, shall I say, with what are essentially the race are an updated version of the 214 compared to, say, what the Greeks had. So in some instances, they're actually using similar equipment that's sourced from the same place. But I do not believe that the Turks have access to these French ships that we're just going to touch on now. So
Yeah, and also they haven't had access to what the Americans have been willing to offer as well.
correct, yeah.
So this was last summer in 2021, but this plays a role into the ongoing disputes that we're also seeing. So the U.S. State Department announced in what was this, July? Right? I just said, yeah. Oh, actually, no, this was back in November. Even better. However, the July of 2021, after the AUKUS agreement had been announced, the French were willing to seal a deal. But the U.S. State Department announced on Friday the approval of a potential sale of naval frigates to Athens to challenge a deal between France and Greece back in September. France responded on Saturday to say that the deal had hardly been done. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency had said it approved the sale of $6.9 billion of 4 Lockheed Martin combat frigates, also known as multi-mission surface combatant ships, just 10 weeks after Athens had signed a memorandum of understanding with Paris to deal with similar French-built ships. The agency also approved a $2.5 billion Lockheed program to upgrade Greece's Miko-class frigate, including adding and upgrading weapon systems and electronics. France's armed forces announced on Saturday that a contract for Greece to buy 3 French frigates had just been signed, saying it scuppered up a competing offers from the United States just the day before. Since we have been in discussion with the Greeks, the American offer is no longer on the table. We also signed the contract with the Greeks. It was initiated a few days ago, said the Armed Forces Ministry to the AFP. The U.S. announcement suggested France faces fresh commercial arms deal threat after the United States wrestled away a massive submarine contract for Australia in a shock announcement on September 15th that ruptured relations between Paris and Washington. Of course, we kind of remember how the AUKUS agreement played out. And what little still there remains to be seen. We'll see in due time how that plays out in the next few years. But after that, of course, the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis set the memorandum of understanding with French President Emmanuel Macron to buy 3 and possibly 4 French Belhara frigates for 3 billion euros or 3.5 billion US. And these would be set up for delivery at the beginning of 2024. So all at the same time, we don't know where this is going to go because 2024, I would bet good money that Erdogan is still in power. But at the same time, I'm not so sure about Mitsotakis and him staying in power with Prime Minister of Greece, because that Greece, as we both kind of know, has suffered quite a few tumultuous election cycles and collapse of governments, keeping their coalitions in power over the last, since 2008, really. So we're in some interesting times.
Yeah, of course, and they're sort of oscillating between governments that chronically find themselves in paralysis. We had the rise of Syriza in the midst of Greek austerity, and then I actually can't remember the lead the Syriza party now. His name just escapes me, but and then he sort of lost power, and now we have Mitsotakis and his government there that almost feel like they're sort of rolling from one they're sort of like rolling from one weak government to another, sort of Italy on a smaller scale in some ways, but just with less humor um, compared to, say, what the Italians get up to. But yeah, the problem is for Greece is that what for the quibbles the one might have with Turkey, or Turkey as they like to be called, and Erdogan, is that the Turks have strong government, they have a strong strategic direction, they have strong policies. Although, as I touched on before, Turkey is actually experiencing quite a bad inflation crisis that was in play before recent events pertaining to Ukraine and Russian gas, etc. It's a domestic problem that Turkey has. But that notwithstanding, they have massively expanded sort of their industrial strength in recent decades. And, they're to touch on the last time I was on, we talked about sort of hegemonic strategic theory. You might say that the Turks have a far more cogent and a more focused direction where they want their country to go, where, say, compared to the Greeks, who are sort of find themselves scrambling and reacting to Turkish moves rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and the thing is that my concern in the future going forward from here would be the question of where does Erdogan go from here? Because right now you are dealing with significant issues at home, which of course is crippling inflation, and of course the issue of managing, of course, some 3 million migrants inside of the country while dealing with Western organizations that you're a part of, and at the same time you've dealt with sanctions and such. And also recently, Turkey has sort of played the balance between the East and the West in regards to the recent announcement to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So,
Yeah,
uh,
exactly. And it is a factor here that we need to consider too. That Turks, the Turkish government at the moment is selling Bayraktar drones to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Turkey has just recently joined the what's that? What do you call the Shanghai? Is it the
Shanghai Cooperation
yeah
Organization.
the yeah the CSO, and it looks like it might even join the BRICS payment system, abandoning SWIFT. Which, although Turkey is a part of NATO, it is clear that they're orientating themselves eastwards at the same time. And then, I mean, in the end, you're probably bound to do a stream on it sometime, but all the while things are playing out as they are in Ukraine and Russia with Donbass, we have another situation that did actually flare up just over a year ago, and has just started up again with Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh, with the Armenia-Azerbaijani tensions. And Turkey has an invariable role amongst all of it. And then, of course, Turkey finds itself mired in the eternal Greek Aegean question. So there's a lot of moving parts here that are occurring at the same time and in several different directions. And Erdogan, I have to say, to his credit, is playing his cards close to his chest, but he's actually making moves that are, you might say, two-faced, but he's, how can I put it? He's being wily about it, shall I say?
Yeah, and of course, right now, if there's the United Nations General Assembly sort of continues and comes to its closing end soon, Prime Minister Mitsotakis had said that we're not our enemy, but we do want to defend ourselves and we'll do so as necessary. Whereas at the current point in time, the response to this has been that this is a hostile rhetoric, unfortunately. So the uh,
Indeed. And,
Turkish
and our and,
delegation
and our
to
friend
the
Semi Gog just brought up the perfect word to describe him, being a pragmatic. Thank you,
yes,
Semi. Uh,
the what came out of the Turkish delegation to the United Nations General Assembly had said on Friday, the unfortunate statement by which is the Prime Minister of Greece, was yet another example of distortion of the facts and is a hostile narrative against Turkey. Turkey's role in the region is beyond and well appreciated by the international community, and of course, this is. Seems to, but of course, and is saying, of course, that we're not enemies or we can work this out friendly. Mitsotakis had said in regards to Turkey's leadership at the United Nations General Assembly that they seem to have a strange fixation on my country. These two nations are set to meet still in New York and discuss these issues behind closed doors. And it's at the same time, they're all supposed to meet with NATO representatives as well this month in order to try and find a solution between the two parties. But I'm going to bring up the map again over some of these conflicted and demilitarized zones to illustrate that this is an issue that is not going to go away anytime soon. Like we had said, that this does go back hundreds of years, but not to mention the issues over Asia Minor and the Persians and the Greeks. It still plays a long cultural memory into that region as well. So as to what we're going to be dealing with for the next several years is this map right here, and what we're going to be debating over definitely for a very long time. But now that it's good to see Semiagog in here as well, which is good to know. Hello, Semi. I'd love to have you on sometime in the future to cover this in more detail, because this is only, I feel like, a very cursory discussion of some events going on. But let me go zoom in real quick so everyone can get a pretty good look at what we're dealing with again. So here we go.
You might have mentioned before, so just go back up there, Prude. I mentioned before, it would have been maybe 10 minutes ago, I mentioned the islands of Imbros and Tenedos. If you see where there's this sort of pinky orange color where they reference Limnos and Samothrake, Imbros and Tenedos are the islands just to the east of that, heading towards the Turkish coast. So just for those who don't know, that's what I was referencing. Yeah, right there. Sorry, continue, Prude.
Well, no, I think that this would be a pretty good, just general overview of this ongoing dispute that has been really going on for decades between Turkey and Greece. As we mentioned, the Lausanne Treaty goes back to 1923. All of that, which is this is a conflict and an issue of tension for over 100 years, or almost 100 years with that treaty, but it goes back much earlier.
Oh, yes, exactly. I mean, if you consider the Greek state achieved independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s, and there was always bound to be animosity because you have this, intermixing, this sort of ethnographic intermixing of Greeks and Turks, and within the Ottoman context, you have Bulgars and Serbs and Albanians and whatever. Like this is a complicated part of the world. I mean, I know we all joke and meme about the Balkans, and there's always that famous Bismarckian line about how the Balkans aren't worth the healthy bones of one single Pomeranian grenadier. But there's a reason why it's complicated. It's not just complicated because it's a meme. It's complicated because it is, and has a complex and often tragic history. Like these things aren't simple, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, no, they're not simple at all, and these things that require our constant attention, which is why we cover them. Like I have covered the situation in Ethiopia multiple times before. This will be one that we will very much come back to in due time, both with paneled guests, but also with a much more flat out presentation, because this is just a very general overview.
Yeah, sorry, just to, someone mentioned it in the chat. I've just missed it. Oh yeah, Minoan. In Greek, B and V are interchangeable, so it's like in English we would say Lesbos, but the Greeks pronounce it as V, so it's Lesvos, but it's the same thing.
Well, there you go. So on that, I guess we'll get close towards our final thoughts here. Furious, if you had anything that you'd like to keep an eye on, or something that you think that we should also be paying attention in the future.
Just before we get there, can we touch on the 214 just for a second?
Oh, sure, of course.
I was reading through this, and I just thought this is such a med trait that what's going on here. So the Hellenic Navy ordered what they call the Papa Nicholas class of submarine, and it was ordered because these submarines are manufactured, or they're constructed in Kiel in Germany, which, along with Wilhelmshaven, is essentially and Bremen, the real center of German naval production. And
yeah, the ThyssenKrupp, right?
Yeah, exactly, ThyssenKrupp, yeah. And so this Greek version of it was from the beginning difficult. They had difficulty with I think the fuel cells to begin with, and when they were trialing them, when the Greek government was first they'd send a naval crew up into Germany to trial the subs, and they were keeling as much as 46 degrees off center, which you can't have. Like, a submarine needs to be especially stable, particularly, A, for the sake of the crew, and then B, with navigation. You cannot have excess movement of a boat. And then also, if you're utilizing weapon systems, I mean, no difference if you're, firing a rifle or whatever, like, the more stable it is, the more or even a tank, it's the same. That's why they use like those sort of self-regulating stabilizing systems for the turrets and the main guns, is because simply the more that you move, the more inaccurate you'll be. And of course with subs you have torpedoes, and nowadays they have some of them even have cruise missiles or whatever, and in order to attain or to be, for your weapon systems to be as accurate as possible, then the more stable the platform, the better it is. It's just it's a given, right? So I think the Greeks got two between 2006 and then 2009 or 2008, and although there had been claims that the rolling problem had been fixed by 2009, a second boat was delivered to Greece called the Pipinos. Although it was actually launched in 2014, but because the Greek government was so far in arrears, the Germans stopped delivery, because I believe it was 6 or 8 that they had originally signed on for. The Greeks were, I can't remember how far. Oh yeah, they were more than 520 million euros in arrears, and had only paid I think 2 billion as a deposit. But they were so far in arrears of payment, the Germans eventually just went, no, we're not giving you any more of these subs. So despite the fact that the Greek equivalents of these subs were quite flawed and had a lot of technical problems with them, it just didn't work out between the Greeks and the Germans. And that's why from this point on, the Greeks have been more inclined to negotiate with other Western partners, Germany aside, whereas the Turks, I suppose to their credit, have been far more forthcoming in actually sort of paying contracts that they sign for weapon systems from the West.
Well, there you go. And here's just, I've had the image and some of the just basic article on board from what the 214 is like from the, ThyssenKrupp. But with that, and I mean, we'll probably revisit this topic very soon, but Greeks defeated by finance. That's kind of funny there. I mean,
yes.
It's kind of been that way for over a decade now.
The perfidious drachma. I suppose they use a euro now, but yeah, it's the old joke, there's not too many Greeks that come from the island of rich people, which we call FPOS,
Well, can't wait until the next financial crisis comes and hits us. Big sad 2.0. We'll only see what happens.
Yes. The Greeks and Greece has many great things about it to like, but financial stability and debt paying is certainly not one of their qualities.
Absolutely. But with that, Furious, if you had any final thoughts besides just the 214 in areas that we should probably revisit in the future.
Oh goodness! I mean, in the end, there's a lot at the present which is moving in motion, and I mean, we've just today obviously we've seen electoral results from Italy, Sweden. We got a sort of surprising or semi-surprising result from a week or two ago. Things are always as they have been since the start of the year, developing in Donbass between Russia and Ukraine. We kind of joke about it here and there, but it really shouldn't be joked about too much, because this coming winter will be a very difficult one for Europe as a result of consequences arising from those circumstances. We've just in this stream, we've just touched on the Azerbaijan-Armenia problem, which looks like it's flaring up again. In the present moment, obviously there are these perpetual tensions between Greece and Turkey, which, given the instability elsewhere, is probably looking more fraught now than it has in recent times. As much as these subjects are actually quite interesting, and I hope we're able to touch on the history as well, because I mean, I know this was a stream for a purpose, and I tried to offer as much background as I can without diving down massive sort of autistic rabbit holes. But when it comes to Greece and the Aegean, it is a very, very long and enduring history. It actually it sits very much at the heart of Greek identity, actually. And you could spend hours talking about the Greeks and the Aegean as a separate stream. If you had say Semigog and AM and myself on, we could probably break the time record. But suffice to say, these are questions with great complications, and we are living in increasingly unstable times, and we'll just have to see how these all play out. I mean, we can't force it; we can only spectate, and we can we can speculate, and we can, that's all we really can do. That, because there's a lot of moving parts, particularly at the moment. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that we're not going to see this issue disappear anytime soon. I think that we will come back to this very soon, probably in the next month, just to
Mm,
see if how things have settled out between talks between the two countries, but also with
mm,
NATO parties being involved as well, since they're both members. I
exactly.
do think that this does illustrate and sort of give some credence to the thesis brought out by George Friedman in his 2014 book, Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe, that the sort of liberal model of the European Union, and by some extension NATO, doesn't erase hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of European conflict between nation states and
Mm,
even in just regions. And I think that we're going to see that really come to the test of how long you can keep that effectively
mm,
managed, especially
mm.
as you had mentioned, Furious, when economic conditions get really rough. Uh,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, because it's all fun and games until the security dilemma is really being put into effect with regards to
Mm,
getting access to trade and vital resources to keep your
mm.
economy afloat and your people fed.
Of course, and that sort of does play. I mean, often, we are a group of people who are, shall I say, unafraid of critiquing the world as is, and the modus operandi of our governments, and the modes of living that we exist in, and the policies of our governments. Like, we're quite, I like to think, open eyed and sober about that. But to keep things, shall I say, stable and locked down, and keeping people calm is easy in an era of plenty. When people have lots of gas for their hot water, they can shower and they can bath, and they can turn the heater on and not shiver in winter, and they can drive to work, and earn their checks, pay their bills. Even for, say, take a country like Greece or Italy that has had debt problems for a long time, and a lot of ingrained governmental bureaucratic problems, right, that make day-to-day living an annoyance in some ways, but these countries still function, right? The thing is, when you then stray away from a time of plenty, when uh, people are having relatives who die for sake of hunger and cold, when nations will have to think, I'm putting this politely, outside the box to remedy their problems. When the basic needs of a nation's people are simply not met, and there's political paralysis, and there's increasing tensions within a country, there's increasing animosity between groups of people who have, shall I say, different ideas and solutions to problems. That ability to lock things down and keep it under control diminishes rapidly. And for those of us who are, shall I say, under 40 or even 50 years old, there's been little flare-ups here and there. Take Yugoslavia as an example, or you go back a generation before. There was obviously the Cypriot invasion of the 70s, and the failed Enosis with Greece. But the vast majority of us in the West have not really ourselves experienced something quite so fraught, and we're on the precipice of that now. So touching on these things and talking about them is, at least insofar that that's what people like us can do, that is all we can do. But needless to say, it will make for interesting times. But I can't remember which proverb it comes, or if it's I know it's out of I can't remember if it's like the Chinese or something, but how it's like an insult to say, "May you live in interesting times," because it often means that they won't be good. So
Yeah, it's definitely a
yeah,
Chinese saying, "May you live in
yeah,
interesting times."
yes, that's
Uh,
right. Yeah.
but with that, we'll get to Frog of the Week announcements and super chats. But before I do
Mm.
that, Furious, you've been very busy this week on top of this stream, and I would love it if you had a chance to sort of promote yourself and what you've been doing.
Oh well, I actually, because one of the people in this field I've actually known the longest is, in fact, Settlers Lament, the world famous Settlers Lament. And I only ever appear on his channel like a couple times a year, once or twice a year. But we actually I was on yesterday morning with him, or yesterday morning my time, and we discussed the Peterson Western values diatribe video that he did. And that was actually quite fun. It was actually a relatively full panel. There were six of us, but I think everyone gave good insights to what he said, and managed to prick holes out of what was a. I mean, I think sometimes he tries to come from the right place. But as we know, liberalism, as we know it, has its severe limitations, and sometimes when you see things through that prism, the world can't make sense. And so that was actually a fun video, and I was very pleased to be on with our friend Settler once again. And mere hours before that, Mr. Apostolic Majesty and myself, we did part 2 of our brief history of Armenia. Sadly, our guest, who actually was there at the start of the video, had to leave, and he didn't rejoin the stream. But our guest, who's a man by the name of Gudia, who's a very, very learned person on Armenia. He's himself Armenian, and Armenia is another nation, a bit like Greece, that has had a tragic past, has had a fraught past, has experienced great civilizational greatness, but also great calamity and tragedy. And it's been a wonder to actually cover Armenia, because Armenia for a long time as a country I felt has been sadly ignored. And because it's a small country today, most people don't take notice of it. But for those who have read classical medieval history, you know that the Armenians are a great people of on the fringes of Europe, and have demonstrated great, courage and virtue in the face of much historical adversity. So that's been good. And yeah, just as always, I'm mostly on Apostolic Majesty's channel, where I believe what we have finished Nations of Charlemagne, which is a series that we've just wrapped up in recent weeks. We are on the cusp of finishing Orthodoxy, Autocracy, and Nationalism, which sort of covers Russia and Greece and the history of Orthodox peoples. And yeah, that's basically it from my end in terms of shilling, Prude. And of course, it's always a wonder to be on your channel. Those of us who geek out on grand strategy and events of our day, or historical examples of strategic thinking, or examples that pertain to the study of strategy, are always hugely interesting. So I very much appreciate the invite, and I'm always glad to be on your channel. It's one of my favorites. So thank you, Prude.
Oh, well, thank you for always willing to take up my invitations. But with that, I'm going to get straight to announcements, Frog of the Week, and I'll do our super chats here real quick. So let me go share my screen here, and we'll get started with the announcements. So let me go to slideshow. Perfect. So as I had mentioned, last week, that this is going to eventually transition to being on Saturdays, and the name will change to Prudent Observations, just because I would like to take my Sundays as the day of rest, but also because I do have some things in the afternoons in regards to classes and ongoing work that I will show off one of these days on the community tab. But it is going to move in that direction. That way, I'm not rushing after church, or after liturgy and the sort of fellowship or coffee hour and such, to head back here to give a presentation. I want these to be fully researched and to dedicate more of my time there. So it will move to Saturday, earlier in the afternoon. That way, we can both accommodate our European friends and audience, as well as our just our own busy work schedules and religious life. On top of that, Substack is going to be constantly updated with my list of outside appearances. So this includes my most recent appearance on Academic Agents Unpopular Opinions, and it will have all future stuff on there as well. So always keep in mind with that one, it's just called a list of outside appearances. Hopefully, I'll be working with Semiagog to appear on his channel with Jimmy Thomas soon. We're working out the scheduling to talk about the ongoing situation in Ukraine. So if you want me to really talk about the military operation, the recent news and mobilization, that will be happening soonish. Hopefully, once we get the scheduling all cranked out and fixed, it'll be on Semiagog's channel. So we'll really get to dive in for those that have been asking about it. Tomorrow evening, around the same time, I will be on Jay Burden's channel this Monday. We have quite a few things lined up to talk about, so by all means do so. He's a fantastic interviewer. I quite like talking with him. And then I plan to record a show either for Saturday or Sunday with Paul Fahrenheit, just to talk about some recent things we saw from What If Alt History, and sort of a very bad political take in regards to American facturing and political balkanizations and the potential for conflict. So that'll be a fun sort of just rip apart a video, talk about some logistics and politics that don't really get enough attention. The Digital Archipelago with Geo will be on my channel this Thursday afternoon. And on top of that, there will be quite a few patron review articles coming this week. So if you are a wonderful backer on Subscribestar or you donate on Substack for the sort of monthly subscription, there's going to be some foreign policy review stuff for you guys as well. So that's a lot of stuff coming in right here. I am going to stop sharing real quick just to make sure that I've got the system audio here working. So 1 second here. Share. Whoops, not that. But with that, we'll get to Frog of the Week here, and let's go. So let's begin. If the music would play, that would be the more important part. But if not, then don't worry. Just imagine that the music's playing. All right, the music did play this time. Fantastic. All right, so this week's Frog of the Week is the Western Narrowmouth Toad. This picture is brought to you by me. I managed to find one of these guys when I was walking the dog. Google Lens gave me the answer, and lo and behold, as did our little guide on amphibians. But you can find these guys mainly across Missouri, Nebraska, as far north as Nebraska, all the way south down to the northern parts of Mexico and the state of Chihuahua. And I managed to find one in my neck of the woods, which is really cool. It does have a very distinct coral-like croak with a very loud metallic peal kind of sound. So these things are very distinct despite their small size. They puff up in the middle. That's where their vocal sacs are if you're a male, and that's what gives them sort of whitish appearance and their narrow mouth and pointed snouts. It does have a very special sticky secretion to protect itself from ant bites. I have some other photos that I'll probably post on the community tab or something like that one of these days, where it sort of just covered my thumb in what felt like super glue. But that is to protect itself from ant bites, because that's primarily what it feeds on. So it'll just usually stand on top of an anthill and just pick and eat at what comes out. And so when the ants try to attack it, it doesn't actually pierce its skin, and it doesn't allow any sort of poisonous effects to get to it. These guys are very tiny burrowing frogs. You can find them in marshy areas or places with standing water like ponds, so it makes sense why they live where I do. And you can also find them in woodland areas as well. Their breeding occurs in early May to late June with many, many hundreds of eggs, the average female laying around 600 or so eggs during their time to spawn and mate. And that is the Western Narrow-mouthed Toad. And he's a good little boy. Look at him right there. Absolutely adorable.
He's a little chubby boy as well.
Yeah, he's a little chubby boy. He's only as big as the upper part of your thumb, where your thumbnail and first knuckle meet. He's but they're
actually from an anatomical perspective, he's actually got a really tiny head though, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, and I think that's just because the vocal sacs are on the side. You do see that with a lot of toads that burrow. That tends to be the case.
I suppose if they're burrowing, it makes sense. Pointed front end, it can burrow with more ease. It's not a fatty face. Gets blocked in the hole, so to speak.
But anyways, I do want to give thanks to the top tier patrons that donate $20 or more or month on Subscribestar, including Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill, User 4A, 5B, 5DB5, Cowering Bugman, Winston Fujimori, Preservatism, Focron, Consumer, and Hunger. You guys are fantastic. Of course, there's always good stuff behind the paywall if you wish to be a YouTube member. Subscribe on Subscribestar. There is merchandise, and of course, buy me a coffee for those that don't want to give any money to Susan and Google. Totally understandable. I just found out today that my Substack had surpassed 1,000 readers that are subscribed to it, both paid and those who enjoy the free stuff. So I'm very blessed and humbled in that regard. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to get to the super chats now. So Robert Gilpin for $10 Canadian says, you two feel like it is right to feel a romantic view towards Byzantium. I've always viewed its fall as a great loss. Love the Metternich Frog avatar. Well, thank you. I quite enjoy the Metternich Frog avatar. I have to thank Dora, who you can find on Twitter as well as Telegram as Neo Baroque. He does a lot of great digital art, and I'm very thankful for his work. Um, I guess I just have a sucker for antiquity, and I think even more so recently due to my faith that I have a great romantic view of it just by the preservation of the works and of Rome and the conquests of Justinian and Belisarius. I do have somewhat of a romantic feeling towards it, but I mean the loss of it is also tragic. I don't know
Yeah,
if you have anything
absolutely.
to add there.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where I think if you're a person who does have admiration for Western civilization writ large, Rome, and if you consider sort of Constantinople as a second Rome, and the what we call the Byzantine Empire as a successful synthesis of sort of the Greco-Hellenic and the Latin Italic. Um, I find it would be impossible to say that I like the West or I like European civilization or that I'm a Westerner of any kind without having a soft spot for Rome. Even though I know we all sort of will indulge a bit of sort of Rome LARP and glorification of the legions, that sort of stuff. There's also other great civilizations and people of the West, and that includes the people of Germania. It includes the Celts and the Gauls, the Celti-Iberians and Illyrians and what have you. There's a whole raft of people from our old history that make a part of our identity. But just Rome is such an indelible part of it, and I think we all have a soft spot for it. Those of us who like, who enjoy, who appreciate and respect our heritage. I just, to take Rome out of that would make that impossible. And I think in particular Byzantium, because it was this bulwark against the East for 1,000 years, and I think is probably one of the greatest exponents and success stories of this synthesizing of a Greco-Roman tradition in the context of Christianity, in the context of when the rest of the world was considered sort of dark. Although I don't like to use the word dark ages, I think it's often an incorrect term. Constantinople was the greatest city of the world, and there's a reason why they call it the city of the world's desire. And for anyone who's traveled to Istanbul and you've seen the old city, you can't but be awed when you travel there. And although Constantinople, Istanbul has been a part of the Turkish world now for half a millennia, just over half a millennia. If you've been to both Rome and Istanbul, you can't help but have the same kind of feeling. It's hard to explain, but it is an astonishing sort of sentiment you feel when you're walking on those cobblestone steps. It's quite remarkable. And yeah, like I said, I don't think you can be a fan of Western civilization and not have a soft spot for Rome and particularly Byzantium.
Yeah, and he continues on for $5 Canadian. You have to find a way to make Byzantium great again in a non-LARPy way. Well, there's a great guy by the name of Henry Hopwood Phillips who goes by Byzantine Ambassador on Twitter, who is an excellent historical guy in regards to the Byzantine Empire and also Eastern Christianity. And I think that he does a sort of a good way at keeping that memory, historical record, and theology alive in a more non-religious sense, although he is a practicing Orthodox Christian. I think he's a very well-written academic, and I think that if you're going to make it great again in any sort of way, preserving its legacy and traditions academically and keeping them in sort of the cultural purview, talking about, I think, how we talk about the Roman legions in the same way that people do on Twitter and other daily Roman updates and things like that. I think the same thing could be applied to, Belisarius and others at the time of the Byzantine Empire. And I think that that's a good way to do it in a non-cringe LARP way that so many on Twitter or on social media tend to do it. So that's just my recommendation, is just remembering history, remembering what came out of it, and to honor it in both an academic and, in the literature.
Indeed, furnish your mind with the knowledge that comes with these subjects. For instance, if you like Byzantium as a subject, read Sallust, read the Alexiad, read Nicetas Choniates. There's a lot to learn, both from a standpoint of there's personal knowledge to dig out from reading the great trials and the great struggle of Byzantium for its place in the world, which eventually, as we know, Byzantium was extinguished. Constantinople was lost in 1453 and Trebizond in 1461, and so all Europe has felt a sense of loss from that. We kind of feel a small part of us, I suppose, died with that. But Byzantium does leave us, thankfully, with a lot of fantastic literature and fantastic artwork. You walk into any kind of Orthodox church today, and the iconography you see is a legacy of the Byzantine period and of Byzantine civilization. And keeping that alive is a small way of doing your task in this respect without LARPing. It's actually a very sincere and honest way of doing so.
Yeah, I would add that it's also deeply theological and deeply filled with prayer. Something that I'm currently taking up on to learn. Maybe one of these days I'll show you guys in the community tab what I've been working on. But yeah, I would add that as well, just to live it in its ways in which you can still today, and to honor its memory. Raging Mantrel for $5 US says, big question, will Germany give Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine? The gay Global American Empire, USG, whatever you want to call it, is suggesting it to him. Europe is running out of Soviet assets to give to Ukraine. I feel like to give any sort of modern MBT, I mean, the Leopard 2 is well known to have a significant amount of horsepower and has been proven by the Germans, at least in military testing, to be a pretty effective main battle tank. I would be a pretty big escalation on top of already the escalation that has been more or less coming out of the apparatchiks of like the Atlantic Council talking about demilitarized and denuclearized Russia. I think that if we're starting to give them, more modern tech, that would be a significant sign of escalation. But I mean, when your usual talking heads like Michael McFaul are saying that we need to double down now that there's been this momentum in regards to the Ukrainian offensive that had happened towards the south in the Donbass, then I hope that doesn't happen, because I'm not pro-Russia, nor am I pro-Ukraine. I'm simply looking at this from a realist perspective that, when this is already escalated post-mobilization and the threat, or at least the, thinly veiled concerns of using nuclear weapons to defend sovereignty, it does raise an important question about, well, we're kind of in very sketchy, unknown areas. And I think that whoever's in charge and whoever's sort of running this has to put that into calculation. And I kind of hope that we don't. Plus, I think that the Germans may not want to give all their stuff away right now in the midst of everything else that's going on. But who knows? I would need to do more research. I would be very ambivalent about doing that. I hope that they don't.
Yeah, and another thing to consider too is, and this is where the war hawks and the chicken hawks, call them what you wish, they sort of salivated the notion of being able to send kit over to be, thrown into the meat grinder that this war is. And for those who follow my channel, I mean, I'm probably slightly less neutral than Prude, and not that I necessarily want one side to win or the other. It's just that it's very easy to see the malfeasance which has occurred from the perspective of our own elites and the West, and what we call the GAE or the EOL, Empire of Lies, doesn't really matter. But the fact that there are people in power who are quite willing just to see scores of young men sort of thrust into this meat grinder, which is increasingly beginning to resemble, for those who are familiar with, the campaign on the Ostfront in the Second World War, the Rzev meat grinder, which occurred sort of outside of Moscow in 1942. I mean, not to that scale, because that was quite monumental on both sides, both for the Germans and the Soviets. But how much longer do we just want to watch this play out as it's playing out? And you're seeing these battles occur, these situational sort of, not set piece battles, but whether it's in Kherson region or it's outside of Kharkov or the Donbass itself, and it's just this incremental grind where obviously there are those who have no qualms with just throwing men and material at them, and in the case of the Ukrainians, what is always a problem, and I mean, you saw this at the end of the Second World War, where the Germans actually had, for instance, enough airplanes, and even though their losses in vehicles began to accelerate towards the end of the war, The Germans actually had tanks and tank destroyers and whatever. What they didn't have was trained crews, and this is going to be the problem with I think sending things like the Leopard 2 is that there have already been quite profound losses by Ukraine in terms of their T-72s, T-80s, those sort of tanks. And yeah, they can be given Leopard 2s, but will they have enough time to train crews? Are they able to train them efficiently and to a specific level of proficiency? And then, do the crews in fact exist who are qualified enough to operate them? Those are always important questions in war. And when you sort of see these journalists or talking heads, and even people who deal with strategy, as a matter of as a commentator on TV or whatever, they don't think of these fundamentals, and they do need to be considered, because in the end, like, what is the purpose of a sophisticated weapon system if you don't have the trained to use it properly? That's
a very good
that's
point.
an immutable consideration in war.
Bolero 393 for $5 US says, how bad will the economic energy issue have to be before the EU will close the Greek borders should there be a migrant crisis this winter, as in 2015? Man, if there was a time to really have one, it would be now, really, as winter gets bad, unless there's some solutions that are found. Which also raises the question, well, it's a real shame that the East Med pipeline was canceled, because that could have been a secured alternative, in the same way that the EU had announced that in its desire to decrease its dependence on Russian natural gas, that it would look towards the Mediterranean, but that nothing has really come fruitfully out of that yet. And that kind of allows the Chinese to sell Russian gas back to the Europeans at a much higher rate. But I don't know how bad it would have to get. I don't. So far, things look incredibly rough, to where even Belgium had shut down one of their nuclear power plants as well. So if they close their borders, I think that would be the smart thing to do. But I'm always counting on the opposite these days.
Of course, and the other thing we're going to see here is, for those of us who are clued in on this, we'll see the major shortcomings and what have always been the intentional misrepresentations of green policy. But be rest assured, be absolutely, convinced by the fact that our elites will find a way to do a 180 on it and actually double down on the so-called grid energy, and how our dependence on fossil fuels mean that we need more of this, despite the fact that following 15 years of persistent subsidy and persistent political support and advocacy from NGOs and climate groups and political pressure, even to the point where now electorally voters are through campaigns of fear and deception want their government to go this way, we are going to see dramatic shortcomings of the ability of renewables to actually power a country, and and give baseline power load to a power grid to cities and communities and towns and whatever. But of course, when this calamity plays out, like I said, be rest assured, climate groups and NGOs will say that we need more. So on one hand, the good side is we'll see these deficiencies. On the others, on the reverse side, there will be an acceleration of green policy, and unless people who see the world as we do, start attaining political power, it will just get worse, regrettably.
Yeah, we're in for the Europeans are in for a rough winter, and so are the Americans. And I think that the ongoing supply chain crisis, especially over food, is only going to escalate on top of a really bad inflationary system.
Absolutely. And moreover, I mean, I'm not saying this would fix everything, right? But one of the remedies of this would be if countries like Germany, countries like Italy, countries like Denmark and Britain, whatever, who actually have coal-fired power plants and have alternative access, would just say, all right, as a temporary measure, we're just going to reopen these things and we're going to temporarily expand our output. At least people wouldn't go cold. But because they're all tied into the ESG, skullduggery, they won't, because there's all this pressure about emissions and climate change and whatever, and so these alternatives that are perfectly viable will be ignored. And if people have to suffer, then too bad, and that there is an insight as to the absolute lack of humanity and decency in our elites today.
Yeah, and our good friend Radical Liberation did a very good stream on the issue of exactly that point, which is that this is meant to suffer. You're meant to suffer, and that it's going to be a very interesting winter in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
And it'll
I
be the
pray for
common
Europe.
person who suffers, you know. I mean, there'll be no politician in the cold house, rest assured.
Oh, of course. It will be the regular folk that suffer and deal for it. Nothing was more dystopic than seeing that Channel 4 morning show do some spin the wheel about them paying the regular person's energy bills.
Yeah, a frightful insight of it. It almost had, you know, like almost like Total Recall vibes, you know, like or oh god, I've just got blank. The movie Blade Runner. You know, like
Yeah.
you're entering hell, but you're going to just throw you a few, you know, a couple of silver pieces to alleviate your temporary misery. There's something so appalling about that. I just can't even explain.
Well, the one silver lining that I may throw out is just some conjecture would be that um, the Euro crisis of 2008, 2009 brought apart European skepticism into the main political mainstream. And that's, I mean, as much as Brexit was by some very large extent a failure, politically speaking, because let's face it, you guys got the referendum and then it was like 6 years of your own administrative state and the European Union meddling in your affairs to stop it from happening. It did show a significant shift to the right. So that may be what this ongoing crisis does. And if what's happened in Sweden and in Italy and Hungary and Poland is any example, then the ongoing issues of the sort of neo-functionalist state of how the EU operates does definitely say a lot. But you know, uh, I mean, even it's slightly not left. I mean, that's somewhat of an improvement over what I traditionally view Scandinavian politics is. But still, nonetheless, that's something to keep in mind out there. But with that, I do have Mr. Furius's Twitter account linked down below if you'd like to follow him for his takes on Twitter and to keep up with local announcements for what Apostolic Majesty is doing as well. If you're not subscribed to Apostolic Majesty already, what the hell is wrong with you? He's the best historian that we've got in these spheres, and he's such a fantastic scholar and gentleman. I've learned so much from him. And
Yes,
with
he's wonderful.
yeah, he is truly a gentleman and a scholar. And with that all, I will see you all next week. If not, I will definitely see you on the Digital Archipelago this Thursday. And I may release one of the videos that I want to do out for patrons early. That way I'm a little oversaturated for content, to say the least. This week has had me incredibly busy, from UO to having Patrick Casey on to the show to this. So with all that, we will see you all next time, hopefully on Jay Burden's show Monday evening. And may you all have a very pleasant start to your week.